Thanks so much. It's good to be here. I fly a lot, and whenever I'm asked by my seatmate on an airplane what it is I do for a living, I've been known to say I work for a nonprofit. Because when I say I'm a Lutheran pastor, then I have to sit through whatever reaction that they have. And I'm used to people sort of looking at me suspiciously, either because they're pretty sure I just lied to them, or because I now represent an institution they distrust or despise, which I totally get. But the reaction that's the most exhausting is from the people who for some reason feel guilty or like they have to justify to me why they don't go to church, which in all honesty, I seriously don't care, like at all. One of the more interesting things folks will say to me is, I'm not religious or anything, I just hope that being a good person is enough. To which I'm like, well, like, enough for what? Avoiding the punishment of burning in the eternal fires of some kind of imaginary hell? I mean, no wonder people act weird when I say I'm a pastor, since apparently to so many of them, even those who literally have nothing to do with Christianity, I broker in a moral reward and punishment system. Like we're all rats in some kind of cruel cosmic lab experiment, receiving shocks from God for going the wrong way and little reward pellets for going the right way in some sort of existential maze. But Christianity has completely lost the plot if it makes itself out to be some kind of sin management program. It has also failed, because when in reality, this faith is about raising the dead. It's about forgiveness and reconciliation and mercy. And recently in a Q&A, someone asked me what I thought Jesus would think of the church were he to return today, assuming I'd say something like, he'd wonder what was up with vestments and organ music. But instead, I said, I think he'd wonder why his church doesn't talk about forgiveness nearly as much as he did. So when I heard we were talking about forgiveness here this year, I knew I had to mention a few things. Number one, what about forgiving ourselves? I'm part of two communities who practice confession in some form, Alcoholics Anonymous and the Lutheran Church. And my friend Richard Rohr describes the 12 steps of Alcoholics Anonymous as, quote, America's single yet very important contribution to human spirituality. And one of the things you have to do is to write a searching and fearless moral inventory of yourself, and then read that to someone else, which is never easy. In 1992, at the time of my first moral inventory, I myself was so filled with shame about the things I'd done, so filled with self-hatred, that the person I chose to hear me read it out loud was Anna, a woman who was literally dying of AIDS. We'd met at a 12-step meeting I was attending in New York City, and the only reason I trusted her to hear all of my crap was that I was certain she'd not be alive 8 or 9 weeks later. We sat in her tiny primary color-soaked apartment in New York while I fidgeted with the papers on which I'd handwritten all my sins and misdemeanors, and she offered me some tea, and after placing a red cup and saucer next to me, she took her seat, and her breath rattled in and out of her dying lungs as my list of affairs and crimes and betrayals rattled out of mine. Nadia, she said when I'd finally read the last page, we've all been there. And that shit is in the past. Stop carrying it with you into the present. She adjusted her oxygen tube for a minute before continuing and saying, it's over, girl, and you're going to be okay. And finally, just saying out loud all the things I hid, all the things for which I was ashamed, all the shit I tried to pretend wasn't there, and have them received without pause or judgment by another person was everything I needed. It was the beginning of freedom. Number two, what about a forgiving God? When I first experienced the confession and absolution in church, the part where everyone stands up and says what bad people they are, and the pastor from the distance of the chancel and the purity of her white robe says, God forgives you, I thought it was total bullshit. Why should I care if someone says to me that some God I may or may not really even believe in has erased the check marks against me for the things I may not even think our sins. This obviously is the problem with religion for so many. It makes you feel bad enough that you will need the religion to help you feel good again. But eventually, for me, the confession and absolution in liturgy came to mean everything. It gradually began to feel like a moment when truth was spoken out loud, perhaps for the only time all week, and it would crush me and it would put me back together. And we have an absolution in my church that goes like this. It says, God, who is gracious and merciful and slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love, loves you as you are. As a called and ordained minister of the Church of Christ, and by his authority, I declare to you the entire forgiveness of all of your sins. In the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Like, no one says that shit to me in yoga class. You know what? Like, and for me, like, I need to hear things like that. Eventually, I began to see grace not as when God is a good enough guy to forgive me for my failings, but like as when God is a source of wholeness and redemption and healing which makes up for my failings. Grace to me is like God's source code. It is the Spirit's renewable resource in confession of sins or completing a moral inventory and speaking it to another person isn't the way we earn forgiveness. It's just the way to force our egos into a posture where we can receive forgiveness. There's nothing you can do that cannot be redeemed by God. And don't let the language get in the way. Like, I do not have a dog in your fight. So if it helps, there is nothing the universe can't make right, or that Buddha cannot hold, or that Our Lady Beyonce cannot slay. Whatever, blessed be your name. Whatever name you use for the mystery and transcendence and self-giving love and creation, whatever you call it, I call it God, it is enough. In my job, I take people's confession, like we have a right for private confession and absolution. I take people's confession and honestly, it's like so much more boring than you'd think. Like seriously, like often I'm like, they're done and I'm like, nothing personal, but I'm super unimpressed by your sin. Like, you should go out and try harder, really. But this one time, it wasn't like boring. It was for real. This girl had something super juicy, and she was really tense at the beginning, and then we went through this process, we went through the rite, and there's a point where I say, do you believe the word of forgiveness I'm about to proclaim to you comes from God? And they say yes. And I did the absolution, and she relaxed, and then we're like laughing. And then she goes, Nadia, I'm so glad that you're my pastor because I just know that you've done much worse than that. So it's a little service I offer my parishioners. Anyway, so I guess what I'm trying to say is, like, if you want to be more forgiving, start with your own story. There's a reason why in the 12 steps, like, confessing our shit is like the 4th and 5th step, and seeking reconciliation with others happens after that. It's the same reason Jesus taught his disciples to pray, forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. Not like he's trying to guilt us into it, as if he's like, wait, I died for you and you can't even be nice to your little brother? Like, God can manipulate us into being good if he can just make us feel bad enough for how much we owe him. That doesn't actually sound like the God that I see in Jesus. That sounds like a manipulative mother. And I think the reason Jesus pairs God's forgiveness with ours is because forgiven people tend to be agents of what they've received. God is the source we draw upon when we forgive. I just know that my own heart is small and selfish and human, and it's just not enough to get the job done. Which leads me to number 3. What about forgiving assholes? I mean, like, I said, like, I don't have a naturally forgiving heart. It's dark in here. And I love a good resentment as much as the next gal. Like, holding on to a grudge or a resentment can feel like just a big, delicious feast that I can just return to again and again until I realize that I happen to be the main course. But inevitably, when I can't retaliate and harm the people who harmed me, I just end up harming the people who love me. And forgiveness was like a big deal to Jesus. He was like that guy in high school who had a garage band and talked about it like all the time. It's embarrassing because so much talk about forgiveness can make this following Jesus thing feel like a Pansies Anonymous meeting. Like our slogan's like, go ahead, treat us like shit, we'll totally forgive you. And I just have like more fight in me than that. If someone does something wrong, I'm not about to pretend otherwise. But holding on to anger about the harm done to me doesn't actually combat it. I think it actually feeds it. Because it would seem that when we're sinned against, when someone else does us harm, that we're in some way linked to that sin, like we're connected to that mistreatment, like a chain through which we keep absorbing it. And in the end, we can actually absorb the worst of our enemy and on some level become endangered of even becoming them. So what if forgiveness, rather than being like a pansy way of saying it's okay for others to harm me, is actually a way of drawing on God's source code of grace, like drawing on it so deeply that I can wield bolt cutters and cut the chain that connects me to them. Like it's saying, what you did was so not okay, I refuse to be connected to it anymore. In all fairness, I should say this is just the kind of thing that got Jesus killed. I feel like you should know that. Because he was going around telling people they were forgiven, and he went about freeing people and cutting them loose, and that kind of freedom is always considered to be threatening. Just ask my friend Don. Don's the Lutheran pastor who lost his job for doing Dylan Klebold's funeral. Dylan Klebold was one of the Columbine shooters, and Don had the gall to think that the promises committed to Dylan by God at his baptism were more powerful than the acts of evil committed by the teen. I don't see that as saying that what Dylan Klebold did was okay. I see that as a defiant proclamation that evil is simply not more powerful than good, and that there really is a light that shines in the darkness, and that the darkness cannot, will not, shall not overcome it. It's easier for me to think that when we forgive someone or something, it's not an act of niceness. It's not about being a doormat. It's actually a lot more badass than that, because forgiveness is nothing less than an act of fidelity to an evil combating campaign. Forgiveness is about being a freedom fighter. And free people are dangerous people because free people are not controlled by the past. Free people laugh more than others. Free people see beauty where others do not. Free people are not easily offended. Free people are unafraid to speak truth to stupid. Free people aren't chained to resentments. That's worth fighting for, because I believe God makes all of it possible because God does for us what we cannot do for ourselves. So if my work as a pastor and a theologian does nothing else in the world, I wish it to do this one thing: that those in my care may know this. If you have been told that God is some kind of punishing, capricious, angry bastard with a killer surveillance system who is basically always disappointed with you for being a human being, then you have been lied to. The church has failed you, and I am sorry. For some reason, religious folks have felt more comfortable with the punishment and reward system than with living in the source code of God's grace. But friends, all the grace and forgiveness and mercy and reconciliation of God is already yours. Draw on it. And forget that whole, I hope being a good person is enough. That's not really even a thing. But the mercy and love and forgiveness and reconciliation of God is a thing, and it's enough. All of it, every single ounce of it is already yours. It will not be taken away as a punishment. It will not be granted as a reward. It is your inheritance as free children of God. Amen.